Thank you. It's great to be here. Nice crowd. I had a little choral ensemble years ago, and we always picked small venues so we could feel like we had a big audience. So I love this. This is very intimate. We're having to bring out more chairs. People are standing. Makes me feel good about myself, which is a really hard thing to do. So we're off to a good start tonight. Thank you all very much for coming out. I'm going to walk through quite a few slides, but most of them very quickly. A lot of them are photos that represent some of it's my own work, but much more of it is work of other people, including some in this room and some in this part of the world. And there'll be plenty of time for conversation at the end. Also, if there's anything I say that you just really need clarification or don't understand or heartily want to contest, then you can do that as I'm going along. What I often say, too, I do a lot of speaking. I have a farm back home in Virginia, and my work is kind of nitty-gritty, on-the-ground work, but I also do a lot of speaking. So I think it's important when you're hearing somebody that you basically don't know, and you're being asked to suspend disbelief for a little bit, that you kind of know where they're coming from. So first and foremost, I'm a farmer. More recently, I'm an author. That's a new thing to me. I have been writing articles for a long, long time. And I like to say that I think knowing who I am is good, and take me with a grain of salt. But I also want to say, quoting a letter to the editor-writer in our home paper, the Bristol Herald-Courier, this is about 5 years ago. This gentleman wrote a long, ranting letter to the editor, at the end of which he said, "It's just my opinion, but it is the Word of God." So I think that's basically how I want you to receive me. It's just my opinion, but it's, the Word of God. So all seriousness, what we're going to do here tonight is move through, first of all, kind of the bad news. And actually, your statistic is on one of my slides. As a matter of fact, its shock value is really quite extraordinary. A little bit about what's wrong with what we've got, and then moving through very quickly some of the examples of a better alternative that I refer to as a bottom-up economy. So that's kind of the plan. So the first several slides are kind of about bad stuff, and we're gonna look at the bad stuff through a couple of lenses. One will be the food system and where our money goes as consumers, and the other will be more broadly looking at what's happening to money flows in the economy. So I'm going to use those two graphs to frame it. You have to forgive me, I've been fighting back a bit of a sore throat, so I'm going to have to take an occasional swig. This graph is more than 2 decades old, but still very timely. A fellow at the USDA, Stuart Smith, made this graph, and basically he said, what happens when somebody spends $1 on food in the US of A? And he looked at it from the beginning of the 20th century till almost the end. And he split it into 3 parts. He said, okay, when you spend $1, whether it's at a local grocer, a big box supermarket, a restaurant, how much of it goes to the input costs that the farmer bears? That's the part at the bottom, the little kind of beige. Diesel fuel, seed costs, calves, vet bills, fencing, hay. Those are the input costs. How much of it actually ends up in the farmer's pocket? That's that piece in the middle that doesn't seem to get any bigger over the course of nearly 100 years. And then how much goes to the post-agricultural part of the food system? The processing, packaging, merchandising, shipping, handling, all of that. And what's quite clear from this graph is that while input costs have sort of had their ebbs and flows, but basically have risen pretty steadily over that century, the 2 big takeaways are, number one, that farmers don't get any more now than they got 100 years ago. Of course, there's a lot fewer farmers, but that's a big part of why. And we pay a lot more for our food, just a much, much smaller part of it ends up back with the primary producer. What happens when farmers get a very small part of our retail dollar? Well, milk is a great example. I'm from southwestern Virginia, the Appalachian part of the state. We used to have a lot of small to mid-sized dairy, and we have one left, one commercial dairy left now, after having hundreds. This is part of why. In 1970, people were paying about 36 cents a gallon for gas. Milk was cost maybe $1.40 in the grocery store, and farmers were getting $11 for every 100 pounds of milk they sold into the commercial milk pool. Fast forward 45 years, gas is well over $2, milk is well over $3, sometimes $4, and farmers are getting $13.50. So in 45 years, all of their costs have increased dramatically, many-fold, but they're getting $2.50 more per 100 pounds of milk. When you do that, when farmers get squeezed, as is true of any business, they tend to push the boundaries, almost of necessity. So whether it's planting on erodible land, whether it's not having fallow and cover crop, whether it's the fence row to fence row, what happens is that a lot of costs end up getting externalized in many, many different forms, including runoff of topsoil, which then leads to pollution of the groundwater and ultimately to a big dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. There's a lot of other costs that are externalized when we insist on very, very cheap chicken or very, very cheap pork. We end up with what some folks call CAFOs, or confined animal feeding operations, with, in the case of chickens, hundreds of thousands of birds in a very, very small place. And that, again, putting aside the issues of animal well-being, leads to tremendous problems where things like manure, which should be fundamentally a resource, becomes a pollutant because there's too much of it in one place. There's other elements of this, what Wendell Berry calls estrangement, this distance between us as consumers and that small group of producers, and that is the very low wages that are in the system. This gentleman, Lucas Benitez, is a farm worker from Immokalee, Florida, and he started a group called the Coalition of Immokalee Farm Workers. He started this because the people picking most of our tomatoes in the Florida heat, tomatoes that end up on our fast food sandwiches and at Olive Garden and on many of our grocery shelves, turns out they get a penny per pound. A penny per pound that they pick. Now, we raise maybe 1,000 tomato plants on our little farm, and at our peak, I'm maybe picking 600-800 pounds of tomatoes in a day, along with a lot of other things. That's a fair bit of work. Think of this here, farm workers of all ages, if they pick a ton, they make 20 bucks. If they want to make $50, they got to pick 2.5 tons of tomatoes. Now that reality, virtually anybody would find horrifying. But the problem is most of us are estranged from it. There's so much distance between the tomato that ends up on our sandwich or on our supermarket shelf and the folks doing the work. The other consequence here, kind of indirectly, is that overall, it's not cheap for everybody by any means. There's a lot of folks who struggle to be able to afford especially healthy food. But in the broader sense, food in the U.S. is cheap. Cheaper than anywhere else in the world in relation to our average income. So one of the consequences of cheap food is how we've supersized it. And I'm going on 60 years old, and I remember when McDonald's introduced the Quarter Pounder back in the 70s, and we thought it was enormous because the previous burgers had been these tiny little, I don't know what they were, 1.5 ounce things. Quarter Pounder was monstrous. Now, not just burgers, but all our food is so big that a Quarter Pounder is now marketed as a mini burger. So along with that supersizing of our food has gone the fact that we have extraordinary health problems. And this graph traces how much we spend on doctors, medicine, and healthcare, that's the blue line, and how much we spend on food. And again, tracing it over about a 50-year period, what you can see is that we used to spend not much on healthcare and doctors and medicine as a proportion of our income, and quite a bit, close to 18% on average of our food. Now, as we've come to expect quite cheap food, we've more than made the trade-off by paying dramatically higher costs. Not to say that the sole reason for our health problems and obesity and whatnot is the way we eat, but it's certainly a driver. Okay, so that's sort of a very quick snapshot of some of the problems with our food and agriculture system. Now we're going to talk more broadly. Have you all heard the term worker productivity as a measurement of economic, overall economic productivity. Worker productivity, which is represented by the purple line, is very simple. It's how much does a given worker in a particular industry produce in an hour or a day, a period of time. And worker productivity increases basically in two ways. Either workers become more educated and better at what they do, higher skill level, and or they're equipped with better technology and equipment. Historically, as worker productivity increased, so did worker wages, which makes sense, right? If a worker is now producing in a day what it took 2 or 3 or 4 workers to produce 10 years earlier, the worker is rewarded. What this graph shows is that starting in the mid-70s and continuing right through to the present, worker productivity has continued to climb. In fact, it plateaued in 2015 for the first time in almost forever, but it's basically been on a steady climb, whereas household wages and average hourly wages have been, for all intents and purposes, flat. So this spot here, this huge gap, used to be very small, this big gap, what that represents is a whole lot of stuff being produced and sold, so a whole lot of revenue being generated, but not going back to the workers. So where is it going? Well, there's your number there. The 62 richest people on the planet have the equivalent wealth of 3.6 billion people. But specifically in our country, it's gone to the top. And in some places to say that is considered to be provocative or kind of a war on success, it was called for a little while, but it's just a fact. Much of that productivity gain, nearly all of it, has gone to a very small group of people. And that's for a lot of different reasons. Some of it certainly has to do with tax policy. Interesting thing that came out in 2014, the bonuses given to Wall Street employees, which is a relatively small group of people, was double the annual wages. Just their year-end bonuses for that small group of people was double the annual wages of all full-time minimum wage workers in the country. So when you have such a concentration of wealth, when you have so much money being made, we used to think, and this was the theory of trickle-down, was that if we freed up the small group of folks who have a lot of means at the top, the investors, the bankers, the leaders of corporations, they would in turn invest that money if we lowered their taxes or eased up on regulations, and that would then lead to new innovation, new investment, new job creation. It would trickle down to our benefit. What we've seen over the last 40 years is that that hasn't happened, that the money has stayed at the top, so much so that you probably know we have over $2 trillion in untaxed income that's in overseas accounts from subsidiaries of corporations. The biggest companies have over $1 trillion in cash. So it hasn't been trickling down. Instead, it's been basically channeled into Wall Street. Wall Street is the financial services sector is a much larger part of our economy now than it's been in many generations. And it's gotten to the point that David Korten, one of my favorite authors, wrote a book called Agenda for the New Economy. He refers to this money as phantom wealth because it's not backed by anything real. Here's part of how we know that. In 2008, the total gross domestic product of the world, of all the countries in the world, the total amount of goods and services produced and sold of every country in the world was about $61 trillion in 2008. That same year, the financial valuation of derivatives, which are one type of instrument used on Wall Street, was 10 times greater. 10 times greater. So what that meant was that this one kind of financial instrument that was making people fantastically rich was equivalent to more, 10 times more, than all of the productive activities of everybody in the world. So clearly that can't be, and that's why David Korten refers to it as phantom wealth. What happens when we put too much of our eggs in the basket of that kind of wealth, of financial wealth, phantom wealth? Well, for one thing, we tend to ignore or degrade real wealth, like ecological capital. In Appalachia, where I am, we have some of the most valuable hardwood forests in the world. I think you all have some pretty valuable hardwood forests in western Arkansas. And while forestry practices have improved over the last 30 years, the fact of the matter is that a lot of our forest land has been managed like this. A whole lot is extracted, but very little wealth stays in. So we're overusing it and degrading the resource, but undervaluing it when we send those logs far away to be turned into stuff, right? It's not only ecological capital. The other thing that the focus on financial wealth, we've neglected real physical wealth. So the American Society of Civil Engineers, their report in 2014, I believe it was, they looked at our bridges, our roads, our railroads, our tunnels. And they said, what would it take, how much investment would it take to bring it up to a B? Not an A, not an A+, not to look towards the future, towards sort of state of the art, just to bring the existing infrastructure up to a B would take $3.6 trillion. Now, that money is there at some level, but we have not been investing it in that kind of wealth. There's a couple more things I want to say about this focus. So the other issue is what happens when our whole economic paradigm kind of starts to focus on big and centralized, big concentrated things. This is a little picture from Asheville, North Carolina, not too far from us. And Asheville's one of a lot of towns, and Little Rock's not too far behind that have a pretty vibrant downtown. Well, that's the way some communities have gone. A lot of communities have gone to rely more on one or two or three really large employers, either a big box retailer or a large manufacturer. If those big manufacturers are part of a mix, that's great. But when you rely too much on a few employers, you not only get vulnerability, like if they pack up shop and leave, a whole lot of people are laid off, but multiple studies, starting with one done by Cornell almost 15 years ago and since repeated, have shown that comparing side by side places with a broad base of local independent businesses, bookstores and whatnot, with those places that have a couple of dominant employers as the bulk of their economy, you get all these other negative social incomes when you rely on one or two big businesses. Income inequality, poor housing standards, even things like low birth weight babies, high disability rates. You kind of wonder how that could be until you start to look into the studies and you see a lot of it has to do with the sense of attachment and community that people have, the neighborhoods associations, because they've also found that bottom-up, diversified local economies have much higher rates of giving in the community, more rates of civic participation in community groups and nonprofits, even higher voting rates. So there's a lot of good reasons to pursue those diversified economies and to be concerned about a model that puts all the attention on one or two businesses. Now, obviously, some of us have made it. And in the United States, quite a few people compared to the rest of the world. But even for the people that have sort of made the American dream with great affluence, what we're finding is that we're not happier for it. Now, there's no question that people who are poor and people who are constantly vulnerable economically, don't know whether they're going to have a job or where the next meal comes from, those folks aren't happy. But what we've also found is that beyond, and the numbers are a moving target, but beyond some level of sort of comfort and security, which in the U.S. might be a $50,000 income in some places and twice that in some others. Beyond that level, we've not been growing in happiness. Our happiness and contentment, as we reported ourselves, has been declining pretty much every year since 1956. Now, I was born in 1957, which is part of why I'm so insecure, because we've been getting unhappier. Every year I've been on the planet, the happiness has been declining. Even to the point of studying particular cohorts. This Psychology Today study looked at kids in a sort of upper middle class neighborhood and their peers in a lower working class urban area, and found that even though they had much more affluence, they also had much more anxiety-related problems: drugs, alcohol, depression, suicide. So again, that's a quick snapshot of kind of some of what's wrong with what we got. And that's also how the book opens up, with a chapter about that. So in working for the last 30-some years most of it in Appalachia, but the last 10 years all over the country and a little bit in some other countries. I've sort of come to this idea that it's going to be a great deal of work to get us to an economy that works better for people, that creates more opportunity and sort of more just outcomes and is ecologically sustainable. It's no small task. There's no simple, easy answer. But the book and this talk briefly frame it in terms of 6 transitions that I'm convinced would help get us there. So the first one, and it is the first because I think it's the most fundamental, is this idea of moving towards households and communities that are self-reliant and resilient, moving from a kind of a consumptive dependence to a productive resilience. What does that mean? Well, things like community gardens. They've popped up all over the country. Detroit has over 1,800 of them. One of the outgrowths of having such an economic catastrophe for much of the last 30 years has been they have a ton of vacant land. So a lot of community organizations, church organizations have been doing that. They've even been building hoop houses and greenhouses to start the plants and then having folks plant. So community gardens. In Appalachia, we have something called Grow Appalachia. The community garden is accompanied by teaching people nutrition, cooking, canning, food preservation, all those sort of old-fashioned domestic skills. This fellow in the middle, Will Allen, is a brilliant guy. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Will with Growing Power. He started a system that is basically a super intensive and highly productive system of recycling nutrients, of raising fish in an aquaculture setting and then using the fish waste as part of the fertilizer for a stream of high-value crops. Will's done that in Milwaukee. His daughter's done it in Chicago. He's taught that all over the world. Will, by the way, before he got into this, he played professional basketball. He's 6'9", and just to mention that I was a Ford Foundation fellow back in 2004. The year after I was, Will was in the next group of fellows, and they had the bright idea to pair us up, and I got paired up with Will. I mean, I feel short anyway, and like with normal people, but for God's sakes, did I feel small. He's a brilliant, brilliant guy, and one of the things that he's done is kind of this common sense approach of how do we maximize the productivity of any given space. Tool libraries. Do you all have one in Arkansas yet, in this part of Arkansas? There's one in Fayetteville. So tool libraries, just a very simple, clever idea. The notion being that a lot of us who have some income buy tools and rarely use them, and we ended up with basements and garages and outbuildings full of tools. Other people who could really use some tools for repairing their car, they're doing plumbing work, gardening, can't afford them or can't afford enough. So a tool library is a library for tools. You check them out, you get a little training. There's somewhere between 55 and 60 of them in the country now. Very simple idea, but again, builds community self-reliance. Saves a lot of energy and waste as well. This is a very interesting group. It's a neighbor group to us. They're in eastern Kentucky. It's a group called MESA, the Mountain Association for Community Economic Development. They were dealing with, as a community action agency, they had an awful lot of low-income and working families that lived in trailers or lived in just drafty old homes. The problem was they didn't have the money to fix up the homes, but they were spending $250, sometimes $300 a month through the fall and winter and never really being warm. So they came up with this program they call House Smart Kentucky. Now the numbers are well over 200 households, but basically they worked with local contractors who would do the energy efficiency upgrades that these homes needed, weatherization, insulation in the roofs, new triple pane windows, etc., sometimes a new heating system. And then they worked with their local utility so that folks weren't getting a handout. They would pay back $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 worth of work, but they would pay it back out of the savings on their electric bill. So if they were paying $250 a month, and after the retrofits their electric bill went down to $100, they took about 2/3 or 3/4 of the savings towards payment of their loan, kept a small bit, so the families end up with a much more valuable home. It's warmer and drier, costs a whole lot less to heat. They're saving a little bit in the short run, and they're paying off their bill, and once it's paid off, they've got tremendous savings. Just a very smart way to, again, make households and communities more self-reliant. In the book, every single transition that I talk about, I put in the context of public policy, because one of the things I've found over the last 30 years is that although there's a lot of cool people doing a lot of cool things all over the country that most of us don't know about, and I learned about many more in research for the book, the fact is we're still small potatoes. It just hasn't added up. That's the plain fact of the matter. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is we had to learn the hard way, a lot of us, to do things better, but part of it's public policy. And so in every chapter of the book, I suggest public policy that would strengthen and accelerate these transitions towards more sustainable and just outcomes. There's some amazing, interesting policy coming up around community gardening and urban farming, for instance. There's new policies on energy efficiency. Some states wouldn't allow the kind of arrangement that Mesa had worked out with its utility for that repayment on the savings of the bill. There has to be a legislative solution. Second transition, so if we start to move towards more self-reliant people and households and local communities that are more resilient, then we're starting to pave the way for what Bali calls living economies, local living economies. In Buffalo, New York, I visited these folks a couple times. Push Buffalo, an amazing group which took the poorest neighborhood on the west side of Buffalo, hundreds of vacant lots and declining buildings, high unemployment rates, and set about getting a hold of that land and those vacant lots, rehabbing them, putting people back in affordable housing, going further steps of using geothermal heating and cooling systems and solar energy, and training ex-cons and others who were hard to employ in really what they call high road construction skills. They now have over 100 people employed who are rebuilding their own neighborhood and making a good wage. Local living economies also are farmers markets. I know you all have several in the region. This is our little market in Abingdon, Virginia, which we started about, it's been about 14 years ago now. Town of 8,000 people. Abingdon has about 50 vendors on a Saturday and close to 2,000 customers that come through. So that's, again, part of a living economy. It brings consumers and producers together, opens those sorts of doors. The Root Cafe, the great Root Cafe, what an amazing example that is, not only of terrific food, but I put it in here because what Jack and his wife have done is they made this commitment to not just open a successful restaurant serving healthy food, but to do it in partnership with farmers in the region rather than on the backs of farmers. And a number of restaurants are trying to do it, but the honest truth is that most restaurants that claim to be farm to table just buy a small amount from local producers. They still buy the vast majority from the mainline distributors. I don't know what Jack's numbers are exactly, but I know he does 100% of the meats are procured locally, and I think it's somewhere in the ballpark of 3/4 that's done of the produce. And very interesting ways that he makes that work to still have really affordable food. Just a fascinating example of that living economy. This guy, Brent Smith, he's a fisherman, dropped out of high school, started commercial fishing when he was 15 years old. 30 years later, he'd fished up the east and the west coast of the U.S., saw steadily declining catches and fisheries and fish size. And so he pioneered a system that he calls vertical ocean farming, in which he raises 4 different species of high-value shellfish, clams, oysters, mussels, and scallops, in vertical columns with 2 species of seaweed. What he ends up with is very clean shellfish, because those are all filter fish, because the water's being cleaned by the seaweed. The surface habitat is restored so that small commercial fishermen want to come in and fish the surface. He harvests the 4 species of seaweed, of the shellfish and the seaweed, dries the seaweed and sells it as a nutrient supplement. The seaweed itself is fantastic at sequestering carbon. So he's cleaning up the local little piece of the marine ecosystem, but he's also contributing to our carbon balance. Another brilliant example of that. A great one from Bellingham, Washington. Very progressive town, Bellingham is, but they have a solar manufacturer, a panel manufacturer there named iTech Energy, and the manufacturer joined forces with the Habitat for Humanity development. They were building 2 or 3 dozen homes, affordable housing development, and not only did they make the homes warm, safe, and dry, but they put solar panels on them, so as they paid back for their homes, they were not having high utility bills. A similar example from Radford, Virginia, where a fella converted an old tire factory to producing structurally insulated panels that are super energy efficient that he sells now to builders throughout Virginia. So this idea of building a local living economy, you know, people love farmers markets. They love the downtowns like Asheville and the main drag, what is it, Market Drive in Little Rock, partly because they're interesting. And interesting communities keep and bring in interesting people. But when you crunch the hard numbers, the fact of the matter is that small retailers employ a lot more people. In this study by Institute for Local Self-Reliance, independent retailers are employing more than double the number of people per dollar of sales than either big box retailers or even more so Amazon. And not only that, we tend to think of the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs and those people as the great innovators, and of course they were, but actually small businesses generate 16 times more patents per employee. So small businesses are often at the forefront of innovation, not just job creation. We need policy to support that. So if we want to have a living economy that supports, let's say, healthy farming practices, part of that would be using our public agencies to support that kind of thing. Well, there's two pyramids here. The one on the right is the USDA food pyramid. They've changed it now to a plate, but this is what they did for years. And what it says is that most of what we eat should be whole grains and fruits and vegetables, and then just a wee little bit meats, dairy, and a tiny little bit of sugar. That's what USDA tells us we should do. The pyramid on the left is how USDA actually spends its money. And what you see is that meat and dairy captures the vast, vast majority of the expenditures, and that fruits and vegetables, which they tell us we should be eating a lot of, actually gets less than 1/3 of 1% of their dollar expenditures. Public policy that doesn't reflect public pronouncements and the things we all agree to makes it more difficult. Another example. Every Democrat and every Republican I ever knew, no matter how far apart they are on other issues, will talk about family farmers and small mom-and-pop businesses like they're the salt of the earth and the backbone of America. Have you ever heard a politician not say that? Well, this is an example from our hometown, just down the road from Abingdon. 3 years ago, the city announced a deal to bring in a Cabela's. There was no Cabela's. You all probably have Cabela's here, right? Yeah. There was no Cabela's in the region, so they brought in a Cabela's. And they announced it on the front page of the Bristol paper, $54 million tax incentive deal to bring in this Cabela's. $54 million to be the anchor store in a development that's struggling to get off the ground. In the same issue of the paper, on the back page, they announced the winner of the annual Main Street Entrepreneur of the Year award. They do a competition every year. And they profiled the business of this woman opening up on the main drag in Bristol, 5 miles from where the Cabela's was going to open. What did she get? A little bit of marketing help and $5,000. So the difference between 54 million and 5,000 is 10,000 to 1. So again, it's great how we shop, what we do, opening small businesses, small farms, organic farms, but if our public policy creates such an unlevel playing field, it makes it really difficult for that bottom-up economy to gain any traction. I'm going to move through these last few pretty quickly so we can open it up to conversation. This idea of prosperity, of wealth, of capital is very, very critical. So you can earn income, but if you can't build your assets, if you can't build your families or your community's capital, then income can be very fleeting, right? So capital and wealth are that. And this fella, Woody Tash, talks about it in terms of that's how we should think about our investment, those of us who have money to invest, as irrigation for the fields of our intentions. Well, for a lot of us, we've taken that to heart, and we've probably all of us said this at one time or another. You give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but you teach him how to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. Unless he doesn't have a boat, or a net, or a paddle, or access to the water. So all my life I've been involved with trying to educate farmers and entrepreneurs, and education and skill building is critical. But education alone doesn't do it if we don't address the fact that an awful lot of the people we want to lift up don't have access to critical capital. So what is capital? Well, it can be high-tech or it can be very simple. This was the tobacco barn that we started our food hub in 1999. And We started in one small part of the barn with tobacco handling in another part. I'm sure FDA, USDA, MSHA, OSHA, everybody would have thrown us out if they'd known about it. But bit by bit, we built out on the barn. We bought the barn from the farmer, who was one of our farmers, built onto it, and it became our packing shed, where about 60 farmers were raising organic produce, free-range eggs, bringing them in, and it was then going out to supermarkets. One simple community asset with a little bit of investment becoming a critical piece of community capital that enabled a whole lot of farmers to do better. Another form of that community capital that's emerging is the idea of either cooperatively owned, or if not cooperatively owned, community-owned retail. One of the solutions to this so-called food desert problem in Huntington, West Virginia, they built they rehabbed an old building and turned it into a local grocery they call the Wild Ramp. They buy from over 150 farmers. Those farmers, in turn, have access to the 50,000 people who live in Huntington. It's been a great success for both. But again, it's capitalizing the community. It's building community wealth. And, of course, here locally, we have what's now the New South Co-op. That's, what, 3 years old, Ben, or 4? 4 years old. Co-op that's going on 24 growers now, producing organic produce, either certified organic or organically raised on the way to certification, allying with another farmers co-op that's producing meats, with sales 2017, probably safe to say it'll post $500,000 for a 4-year-old co-op. That's great. That's tremendous opportunity for a bunch of farmers. It's also enabling the community to eat a little bit better. So you have, and the farmers are spread out. I just had a conversation with Ben before I came, and from the edge on the west heading towards the delta in Forest City. So it's quite a range of farmers. Another form of capitalizing communities in the energy sector is this idea of solar gardens that was pioneered by a group called Clean Energy Collective. There's a tremendous growth in rooftop solar around our country, and there's still lots of roofs that can have solar, but rooftop solar doesn't always work. Sometimes the buildings can't support it, sometimes they're not angled in the right direction, sometimes people rent and they can't get their landlords to put solar on. This solar garden allows renters, it allows people who own buildings but don't have the right pitch or angle to buy into a garden of solar panels. And in this particular picture, it was about 20 families in a neighborhood in Colorado. It was the first one. Now they're in 10 states. They go in together, they get the panels at a discount price because they're buying them in bulk. They get the installation done much cheaper because they're all being installed in one place. They're installed in a place where they're perfectly suited to collect the maximum amount of energy. Everybody benefits. It's a stimulus to local contractors doing the installation. And families can buy 1 or 2 panels if that's all they can afford and get that amount knocked off their bill, or they can buy enough panels to offset all of their electric. Again, simple but smart way of using money wisely to build local wealth. I'm going to skip a couple here simply because, well, actually, I'm going to do quickly a couple policy slides, and then I'm going to go at breakneck speed. So we talk a lot about wealth creation, and in the United States, the fact is that until really the 2000s, with a little bit of a growth in people's stock portfolios, that for most of our history since World War II, wealth accumulation in the United States is largely due to home ownership. Most people who would consider themselves middle class, most of their wealth is in their home, right? That's been the truth. In our federal housing policy, the Federal Housing Act of 1934 was written into federal law. It wasn't just banks, discriminatory language that strongly discouraged realtors and bankers to invest in or sell homes to African Americans specifically, people of color generally, but primarily African Americans, with language like don't give money, don't put in areas where there's an infiltration of a lower grade population or neighbors are lacking homogeneity. That was part of our federal housing language until 1968 when it was finally removed. So when we look at the vast wealth differential on average between white families and black families in the United States, that's a very big piece of it. Basically, the black community, for the most part, missed out on much of the wealth accumulation that white families were able to do by becoming homeowners, which was a relatively new thing at that time. Quite extraordinary. So again, another example of how important it is to understand the policy context while we're doing this local work. The other transitions in the book I'm just going to mention. So if there's a lot of cool stuff going on about bottom-up economy and resilience, if communities are starting to build wealth in different ways and capitalize their households and their neighborhoods, how do we take it to scale? Well, there's a few good examples of it. One is Organic Valley. That's still a family farmer co-op that has over $1 billion in sales, and they've managed to grow from a small Wisconsin-based co-op to a national co-op, but keep connected to their local producers. So I just put them out there as an example that it's possible to scale up without losing the fundamentals of why you got started in the first place. So we hear about like Ben & Jerry's gets bought up by a big corporation, everything changes, but there's exceptions to that rule. We've seen it in a place, DC Solar United Neighborhoods, that started in one neighborhood of DC, expanded to all the neighborhoods of DC, and then spun off into a national organization encouraging solar. So this idea of scaling up is quite possible. The fifth transition is about changing the public debate, and I'd love to talk to you more about that if we had more time. But it has to do with a number of things. Right now we're in a point where we all know we have a really, we could say problematic public debate, would be a generous description of it. There's a lot of different reasons for it. We have an extraordinary level of media concentration. 6 companies own 80% of our media. Part of the antidote to that is low-power FM and community-owned radio and TV like Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky. Part of it is this emergence of community theater, amazing example in Colquitt, Georgia, called Swamp Gravy Theater, that's been both a way to build bridges across the racial divide in that town, as well as an economic stimulus and a real empowerment for the community. Very similar thing happening in Harlan, Kentucky. Part of it is taking some of the finer things like art and embedding them in the community. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, they do this annual art prize for about 2 weeks. They have thousands of pieces of art that are actually, they're not in galleries, they're in small businesses and dentist's office and professional shops and community centers, so that art becomes embedded in the communities and the community goes into its normal places to be uplifted by art. Quite extraordinary. And part of it is also reclaiming public spaces. This is from Maine, from Portland, Maine, Congress Square Park. I wrote most of this book in Sicily, and one of the things that the Italians have, I think the Spanish do as well, is vibrant squares. So the Italians are on their daggone cell phones every bit as much as Americans, but you get to about 7 or 8 in the evening, the piazzas start to fill up with people. The cell phones, for the most part, go away. It's from babies up to 90-year-olds, and it's this life. It's this community life. We haven't historically had that. Farmers markets are kind of giving us a little taste of that, but these kinds of public spaces like Congress Square Park are critical, because when you think about it, in those spaces, if it's done right, it's the closest we get to mixing in an increasingly segregated society. We're segregated by race and class and other things. We mix. I mean, at our farmers market, we'll have people in line who are Amy Goodman followers and Glenn Beck followers, and they're just right behind them in line buying our produce. So community spaces bring different people together in a way where it's harder to demonize one another because you have a common interest. So one person put it, I forgot the name of this author, I apologize for this, but talked about that the current paradigm is always a paradigm of more, that there's never an end. Whatever we have now, it's not sufficient. And these folks who wrote a book called Enough is Enough say we need a new paradigm, and the paradigm ought to be enough, like a Big Enough burger at the Root Cafe, and many, many more examples of that. I'm going to skip those and just say that the last transition in the book gets at how do we take all of this energy around rebuilding our local economies and rebuilding our communities and public spaces, and turn it into a politics from the bottom up. And I'm going to stop here, but there are some very interesting participatory democracy things that are happening, like participatory budgeting, like citizens' juries that are cropping up around the country as a way to rekindle the debate and to get into more meaningful ways of grappling with our difficult issues. Because right now, most of how we engage in the public debate is clicking on petitions or, clicking our loathing of something that somebody did on the other side of the fence. And these are ways of bringing different people together to converse, to debate, to make decisions. Very, very interesting stuff. So I'll call it quits there. I went a little long. I apologize, but I think hopefully if you have the energy, we still have some time for some conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. All right, we have some time for questions, so raise your hands and please wait for the microphone to come there. So come on, good opportunity. Quiet audience here, my goodness. All right, question right back here.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. My name is Claire. I'm a second-year student at the Clinton School, so we're very pleased to have you. That last slide, Transition 6, I imagine that takes a lot of cooperation between the citizens and the city's government to sort of negotiate the terms of how much citizens are really allowed to participate in these kinds of things. So in your experience, I'm sure it depends city to city, but in your experience, is that a process that takes years to develop that relationship, or can people just show up and change it overnight?
Definitely not overnight, but neither has it exactly taken years. Participatory budgeting as an idea, the idea is basically that the governing body, it can be the town council, the county supervisors, the borough chief in a bigger city, it can even be a school board theoretically, but the governing body takes some chunk of their general fund, usually a very small chunk, and gives it over to a group of citizens to decide how to use it. Not to advise, but to decide. That's the sort of the sea change difference, right? So it started in Brazil in a place called Porto Alegre, I think it's called. It's now in something like 50 to 60 communities in the US. The first place in the US was called Vallejo, California. Vallejo came out of bankruptcy in 2011, and they did a very bold thing. The new leadership of the city, I think it's a town of maybe 100,000, it's not a big city, decided to institute, they had studied this participatory budgeting because the community was very fractured. People didn't trust the government. How'd you let us get to this point? So as a sort of gesture of goodwill and trust building, they said, okay, we're going to give you some of our money. So Vallejo has now done it for, I believe, 4 rounds, and each round they've put aside somewhere on the order of $2 million. So it's a small part of the city's budget, but a substantial amount of money. And then the process, it's in Chicago, it's in New York, it's in a lot of different places. And there's a national group called the Participatory Budgeting Project, which is fostering it, nurturing it. Basically, then citizens come together, as many as they can possibly get, sometimes virtually as well as in person, and they brainstorm ideas. What does our community need? It can be an art center, it can be a business accelerator, it can be fixing the doggone sidewalk, it can be a senior center that needs upkeep. Then they elect this broad group of citizens after they've brainstormed a big chunk of ideas. They elect a group of citizens who then dive deep into each idea. So they know they got $2 million from the city. This project would cost $500,000, this one would cost $50,000. They really vet the ideas. They become experts on the ideas, oftentimes with help from the elected officials, their staff, sometimes outside experts. Ultimately, then, they give their top priority ideas that then go back to the whole community for a vote. And whatever they choose, that's how the money gets spent. So it's really, you know, some people criticize it because it is, you could say it's token, in terms of the percentage, but it's real money, and it's making citizens, many of the people who go through the process not only get excited about the process, but they report that then they're just way more engaged in community affairs of all kinds after that, because it restores a sense of, hey, I have some say in my community. It's really critical stuff. So the short answer is, in several cases, it's actually come out of sort of really bad situation as a way to try to jumpstart something new, and in other cases, it's been sort of a slow drumbeat to build a relationship.
Questions? Yes, right here.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Emily, and I'm a first-year student here. My question is about your supportive policies. Given our current situation, I'm wondering what you, from your own personal experience, what sort of actions you would recommend for citizens to take to encourage these supportive policies that you're recommending. Thank you.
Sure, it's always been tough. It's tougher than ever now. I've, for quite a few years, been trying to impact public policy, usually when it ran up against something that I was working on, whether it was launching a food hub or a farmer's market, or whether it was trying to deal with low-income housing or an energy issue I was working on in my community. One thing I learned from that, although it sometimes happens at the top, sometimes there's a progressive thinking person at the top that changes things, but more often than not, I've found that you have to kind of build something on the ground that is demonstrably successful, and then that becomes part of how you persuade policymakers to change things. That tobacco barn that I showed a picture of, about early into our second year, we invited the legislators, both Republican and Democrat, they were mostly Republican, and people on our state tobacco commission to come down to a big open house. And what they saw was not hippy-dippy farmers or transplants like me. They saw mostly local boys, a few girls, but mostly boys, lifelong tobacco farmers who had switched over to organic produce, were very pleased with it, and that all was sort of in the context of this facility that was enabling them to gain access to market. That led to a substantial opening up of their minds about food policy and agriculture policy. So that's one example. So I think all over the country now, I'm kind of arguing for two things. One is that the people doing this work, Bren Smith with his vertical ocean farming, and Kimber Lanning doing amazing work in Phoenix, Arizona, and folks in Mississippi with One Voice Mississippi doing co-ops. Where this bottom-up alternative economy work is happening, we need to politicize it, not in the sense of choosing sides, but in the sense of realizing that public policy will ultimately determine whether it stays on the margins as a cute little exception to the rule or becomes a serious part of how we make a living. And so I think people in the trenches who are already working, 60, 80 hours a week, they still have to put on this consciousness about what policy is holding us back and what would make this work better. Simultaneously, the policy wonks, who are usually at the state capitals or in D.C., there's a lot of good people there, but for the most part, they're pretty detached from the reality of everyday people, whether they're farmers or coal miners or loggers or working stiffs of any kind. So I've been really knocking on their door, and I think other people do too, to say, these policy battles are too esoteric. You have to get out into the field and see how it translates into reality, and that will empower it. So, I mean, it's kind of what I've been arguing for a while. I think now we just have to do it even more so.
Any other questions? Yes, Sasha.
Hi, my name is Xochitl Delgado Solorzano. I'm a second-year student here at the Clinton School, and I'm still trying to formulate my question, so bear with me. But historically in the U.S., periods of economic growth have correlated with increase of immigrants in our country, and I know that in Arkansas, especially in northwest Arkansas and other parts of southern the U.S., there's been a lot of revitalization in communities because of increase in immigrants. And again, with the current political climate and the anti-refugee, anti-immigrant sentiment, do you think that it'll have a correlation, or if it'll be affected, or I'm not really sure what my question is, but related to that, will this continue to happen if policies are enacted that are anti-immigrant, anti-refugees?
Well, it will impact this kind of bottom-up economy work, this building better communities, more in some places than others. More in the southwestern part of the country than in Appalachia, for instance, although we certainly have immigrants in Appalachia. Kimber Lanning, I mentioned briefly, she's in Arizona. She started Local First Arizona that has over 2,000 businesses now, and they're all independent businesses. 3 or 4 years ago, she started a Latina entrepreneurship training and funding. I believe it's called Fuerza Local, probably not saying that exactly right. Similar to other sort of business startup entrepreneurial training, but all taught in Spanish and focused on the realities of these recent immigrants, for the most part, mostly women. It's been extraordinarily successful because part of what they're doing is giving them the business coaching, but they're also nurturing their innovative ideas and then helping them, very importantly, get access to some sort of low-cost loan or funding. It's one of a few examples, and we don't have enough of them that I know of, where people sort of fundamentally recognize not just the needs of immigrants, but the kind of innovative energy that typically comes. I mean, every wave of immigrants of different nationalities have brought with them different foods, different cultures, and other things that usually end up translating into innovations of some sort that eventually percolate into the whole system. And also the immigrant culture, like rural culture in Appalachia or the Ozarks, were also cultures of resilience, right? So of doing the most with what you had, making do with what you had. That's also very true historically of African American communities in big cities that we overlooked. So I guess again, the short answer to a complicated question is, in terms of the public debate dimension of this, most of the public debate now is, and understandably so, either sort of very negative about immigrants on the one hand, and the wall and all that stuff, or on the other hand, defending the fundamental rights and sort of the humanity of immigrants. Maybe a missing piece is talking specifically in the details of actual things, of the extraordinary innovation, of the new technologies and new ideas that have emerged that are now creating local businesses and local jobs. I mean, we usually lack that in our big public debates, is grounding them in real things. I think there's enough Americans on the fence in the middle that if they understood what's going on in Phoenix with Fuerza Local and many other places, it would just cast a totally new light. Just like in Appalachia, we've been fighting this fight for the last 20 years to redefine what it means to be a hillbilly and to say it ain't all Duck Dynasty. So, you know, I mean, I think that's part of the picture of changing the public debate, is recognizing the amazing contributions, not just in some grand way, but in specific details.
Listen, I want to thank Heifer International for co-sponsoring this with us, our neighbors at Heifer. They do great work and obviously do wonderful work, not only in America, but all over the world. I also want to say that every Saturday morning I have breakfast at the Root, and Corey and Jack are here. And I encourage you all to join us for breakfast anytime at the Root. Thank you for highlighting them. I hope now you will come visit with Tony as he signs Building a Healthy Economy from the Bottom Up. He made a big effort to be here with us tonight. He's got to go back to Fayetteville for a conference tomorrow. So let's thank him very much for joining us.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. I'll be over here, and if you already bought a book, I'd be happy to sign it. It adds about 7 cents to the retail value. And if you're interested, you can come and browse the book before you decide. Thanks so much.